So Cosmic Exploration has basically finished up for me. We here on Marlboro, we have already finished up the last upgrade, and with that done, I can now feel confident in talking about my thoughts and feelings about Cosmic Exploration as a whole. But to kind of sum it up, Fisher definitely came out in top in terms of content quality and in terms of actual gameplay, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's without its faults. So I'm going to take a look and I'm just going to talk through like the missions, the relics, the planets, uh, briefly touch on the story because I think it's worth mentioning, and then I'll just have some overall thoughts. So sit down, buckle up, grab some popcorn, enjoy your ride into work. So here we go. So the core part of Cosmic Exploration was this new mission system that we got introduced to back in like 7.1, 7.2 when they showed it off. And the idea was that you would be given a mission which had a specific objective at a specific place for Fisher, and you had to complete it within certain requirements, and that gave you either a uh, gold, silver, or bronze rating, which is cool. I dig that. I love it a lot. I think it was a great structure, and I talked about this a lot right after Sinus Ardorum came out in a video where I talked about the initial thoughts I had on Cosmic. I think the mission structure was great. Uh, it was really, really good in Sinus for teaching people how to use their kits. Uh, if you had never done crafting or gathering or even fishing before, these missions had a nice little, progression curve starting from class D all the way up to class, class A, EX, EX plus, or A1, 2, and 3 as they used to be known. They had that nice curve where you could kind of just learn your kit as you go. Each mission seemed to have like a specific thing that it was testing you on. Like, do you know how hidden fish work? Do you know how double hook works? Do you know how to specifically target fish? Well, that was a big one. And it was great, and that carried through the rest of the planets. Like all four of the planets. Well, technically one moon and three planets, but neither here nor there. Um, two moons? I forget now. Either way, across the three so-called planets, uh, and one moon, that was pretty much the structure that it followed. And for Fisher, there was very much in each of those missions one thing that you would sit down, look at, and go, "This is what I need to know how to do." And it was supported by that core feeling of Fisher having to work with other people, and you would talk to other folks and get an idea of like, here's how everything works and here's what the fish that are biting, and then you'd be able to be able to solve that. What was really a good energy driver for this, or a good energy, like a good it was a good driver for this motivation, like motivating you to learn, was the timers. The fact that almost all of these missions had some timer where you could fail if you did not do what you're thinking, not even get bronze, just straight up fail, was great. That encouraged you to be focused and to learn and to practice and to do what you need. And for Sinus Ardorum, some of those missions were, a little overtuned. I think they could have added like another 30 seconds to 60 seconds on some of those missions would have been fine. But overall, I think they were okay. I think I talked about this too. Like the timers were great on some of those, and you really had to do it. And sometimes you had to do a mission once. You couldn't do it once. You had to do it 2 or 3 times in order to get that gold completion, just to get everything so that everything lined up well. And that was kind of fun. That was enjoyable. That really put in that focus of, I need to go and learn my kit and figure out what I need to do. And so that was great. And then at the end of patch 7.2, right before Fena came out, they nerfed that. I think probably the biggest thing that frustrated me with Fisher in Cosmic Exploration was the fact that it got caught up, or was potentially the reason for, I do not know, the blanket 30-minute timer that was being added to every mission moving forward outside of a handful of EX and EX pluses. Initially, when this 30-minute timer was added, we were thinking like, oh, maybe it's just a catch-up mechanic because that the way that this cosmic is set up, and I'll probably talk about this a little bit later, is you don't really need to go back to the previous planet. You just can do everything on the most current planet. And so we thought, oh, maybe it would just be a catch-up mechanic to make things easier. That would be fine. But then when Fena came out, it was nothing but like 30-minute timers for everything, with the exception of a handful of the EX pluses or sequentials. And that was very frustrating for some reason. I know part of fishing is definitely coming down to, making sure that, getting the fish to bite that you need. And as I know, people will fight me on this when I say it, but there is, in fact, a skill to being able to manipulate the fish in your favor. That is a skill. Knowing your kit, knowing which buttons to push at the right time, knowing how to respond to whatever is happening. That is a skill that fishers have that is needed. It is not pure RNG. And the fact that they made it so that some of these missions you could not fail anymore. You could guarantee yourself 30 minutes, in 30 minutes, to get a gold if you just fish, and that's it. You don't have to do anything else. You just fish. You don't have to do nothing, no thoughts about it whatsoever. You could just accidentally stumble into a gold after 30 minutes. And that was really frustrating coming out of Sinus Ardorum, because you went from this planet where it was like you had to learn your kit to missions where you didn't. And there was maybe only a small fraction of missions that maybe could teach you something. And there were barely many of those left on Sinus after the nerf. And it basically just went from like Sinus being this amazing education planet, just great for learning. And if you know me, I love my education stuff. Uh, to basically nothing, to just like to nothing. And with Fena, it was the same way. The Fena missions were incredibly dull compared to some of them, some of the, like the Sinus missions, and even compared to some of the other missions that we've seen for Fisher. Some of them, if you have never fished before, yeah, there'll be a challenge, but that's because you never fished before. If you have done ocean fishing, you were familiar with everything you needed, and you probably had everything you needed to know. And that's a really low bar, which for some of these missions I think are fine. Like, yeah, I'm not saying every mission needs to be an ultimate challenge, but proportionally, at the higher tiers, the Class A's, Class EX and EX pluses, some of the EXs were easier than the Class A's. Some of the Class A's were easier than like the Class C's. Uh, some of the EX pluses could be done like super fast and farmed. Uh, so it was very disappointing to see that that there was a lot of, I know that there was a lot of community feedback from parts of the community that was like, hey, these missions are too hard. And I even got caught up during Sinus. I was there, I wasn't saying anything in chat, and someone was like, oh yeah, um even the fish guy, Fruity, says that these missions are impossible and should be changed. And I just was like, hold on a second. I never said that. I never did. And I I, in all caps, literally, I think responded in chat saying, "Don't you put words in my mouth." I did not say that. Um, because the sinus missions were great. And if anything, they got easier because of the 30-minute timer. And it isn't, I guess to reemphasize it, it's not me saying that these missions were super hard and that was good. It's like, I actually thought that the initial sinus missions were well balanced. They needed a little bit more tuning on the time, that I agree with. Some of the bite rates could have been tuned, also agree with. But overall, Fisher had like the best suite of missions. They were great compared to what Botanist and Crafters did, and I did all of them. And I'll talk about why in a second. I did all of them, and it was fun as hell to be a Sinus Ardorum Fisher at launch because those were interesting missions. Even the Class A's, some of the Class B's were all super duper interesting in solving how you wanted to get those done and the actual execution of how you did it. Um, and it was a ton of fun. And I'm not saying that they all need to be hard, but they needed to be a little bit more engaging. The sinus missions were very engaging, and then afterwards they weren't. They, it was really came down to that timer, because if you have a time limit and you put a time limit on something, you have to be focused. You have to figure it out. You have to solve and you have to optimize. This is one of the big things that Fisher does, especially at higher, I mean, some higher level play, but not really. But uh, that's what we do is, we optimize. Having that there to encourage people to do it, to optimize, would have made the fishing community even stronger than it did by the end of Cosmic. And adding that 30-minute timer removed that motivation, kind of destroyed or at least dismantled a lot of the structure that the missions brought into helping the community learn as a whole. I feel like there was a lot of potential loss in that as well. The other thing too is we had, talking about engagement, we had cross-class missions in Sinus where you would have to fish up materials, craft them with a crafter, and you had to do that to finish, to complete the mission in gold. And it was cool as hell. Like, that was possibly the best type of mission that they could have done in cosmic exploration, and we only ever saw it in Sinus. And that was disappointing. Very disappointing. Because not only were they fun missions, but as a whole, they encouraged players to do something that they hadn't done before. I had to level crafters, which I wasn't planning on doing anytime soon, because I wasn't in the crafting mood, so I just didn't level crafters very much. I leveled like one or two so I could repair, and that was about it. But I had to level a bunch of crafters in order to unlock missions, in order to complete these sequential missions, or not these sequential missions, these cross-class missions. I was motivated, encouraged, and even rewarded for playing the game in ways that I would not have done originally. I learned things. I am not ashamed to admit that I had never touched an expert craft until Cosmic Exploration, and I learned expert crafts, and let me tell you, expert crafts are fun as hell. But then they're gone. Then they were gone. After Sinus, we never saw cross-class missions come back. And that is so disappointing. Like, that was the other thing that made me kind of upset with Fena. Fena is not my favorite planet, even though it was kind of a cool setting, and I'll talk about that a little later. Um, cool setting, not my favorite planet because the missions were kind of dull overall. They weren't hard. Um, I think the EX Plus missions on Fena in Fusing Way were probably the strongest of the missions on Fena overall, but that's about it. It's like two missions out of the whole thing. I was just like, oh yeah, okay, these aren't as fun. Um, so yeah, a lot of the brunt of my feedback is about that Sinus into Fana mission transition because we never got any cross class missions. Almost every mission had a 30-minute timer. Almost every mission had a 30-minute timer, but even then, if it didn't, it was still almost too generous, even if you didn't know what you were doing, to the point where there was no fail state. When there is no fail state, you don't get the satisfaction of completing it because it feels like a gimme, and you don't really get encouraged to learn, which I think a lot of the community, even the average player, would have benefited from, especially in Fisher, because Fisher is one of those classes that is very complex in terms of, well, it's not okay, it's not complex, it's deep. There's a lot of things that you can learn. And the sinus missions were really good at teaching a lot of those basic fundamentals, and they could have continued that with the repetition. And by the end of Dawn Trail, if you had done Fisher, you would have been better for it. Like you would have been a better Fisher by the end of it. But now I feel like you don't really gain much. Um, so, but yeah, most of my feedback's on that like sinus Fana transition because after that, it didn't really change. Once you had Fana, you basically had Oasis and Acacia, and they were basically the same thing. Actually, in some cases, between Oasis and Acacia, it felt like they just were the exact same mission types with just different fish. That was it. Some of them even had almost identical like data rewards for the relic. So, I mean, outside of also getting less and less missions, we didn't have any sequential missions in Acacia. We had even less missions and even less sequential missions and even not as challenging missions in Oasis compared to Fana. And like it was it went from being this really cool thing that was like feeling like you were mastering something, like feeling like you were really understanding what it was you needed to do, like that, like that feeling that you get when you're doing something, you're learning something, you're like, man, I understand this, I get it, and then you get into that state where you're just rolling with it. That's what I had in Sinus. Loved it in Sinus. Never felt it again with the rest of these planets because it went from something that you were trying to engage with to a thing that you were just trying to check off. And with Fisher, we already have plenty of things to check off, but we don't have a lot of engaging things. Outside of big fishing, outside of ocean fishing, Cosmic has a place for engaging fishing content, and it's still engaging fishing content. It's not like it's not engaging, but it's a loss of potential, basically. So, the final thing on missions though were mastery missions, which I talked about a little bit in a previous video. These are really cool, but carry on with the trend of where were these from the beginning, and or there was a lot of potential that could be on them. I think the mastery missions were cool, but because they were kind of just spammable, both the jellyfish and M3, the topiary serpent, it kind of undermined the other feature they had, which was a high score. How high of a score can you get without, within the time limit with the resources you have? That was fun. I loved trying to figure out how to optimize these missions, but they didn't stick as much because what was the point? Like, there was no point in, uh, at least based off the math we had, like, yeah, it was a little bit better for like some of these missions to just do them as best you can to get to get the 500k points, but it gave you so much that you didn't need to do them very often, or you just had to hit tier one. Like the scaling of the rewards was very like it scaled sharply up to that first tier because there's two tiers in these missions. Scaled sharply up to that first tier where you got a ton of points just for hitting that first tier, and then there wasn't as much of a reason to go from tier one to tier two. So for the achievement minded folk, they probably don't want to go all the way up to tier two. They just want to get to tier one. And that kind of undermined it because that you could get to very quickly. Like that was almost cheesable in some case. And I did talk about like the jellyfish farm at one point, which did get nerfed. Well, sorry, it didn't get nerfed. It actually is still exists as of recording, but the topiary serpent farm is the one that came up, and I actually don't even think I made a guide on that one yet because it just feels weird. Like like you come in, it's like, yeah, you're given this, like, oh yeah, I've created all these mastery missions for you to come and test your skills and practice these things and blah 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 blah, and there's nothing. Like it was just kind of like meh. Um, I think up until recently, I think I had the highest score known within the fish court on M3, and then somebody I think beat it by about 30k, which is great. Uh, but the fact that there's like no official tracking on that is kind of disappointing. Like I would like to see that again. I know everyone was like, "Oh, leaderboards in the diadem were bad," but this was this was fine. I think leaderboards for these missions would be kind of fun. So yeah, I talked about mastery missions a whole bunch in another video, and I don't really have much more to say, nor a ton that I want to say, except really cool. I'd love to see more mastery missions added. Overall, the idea of the mission structure I think is very good. This is something that I would love to see move forward. It looks like we're going to get something maybe similar to it going into Evercold, or at least like an objective type thing going into Evercold for like that new weekly reward system where it's like do this, get a reward. Like that's cool. Um, Basic but cool. I like it. But I think the mission, like the mastery missions, especially the style, what the different missions, like the diversity missions, were probably the most fun for Fisher because you had to really know how what fish were in the fishing hole. You had to know how to manipulate the bites to get what you want, and eventually unfortunately they kind of became formulaic because they were like, oh, it's too precision, too powerful, surface slap and lure, that's basically what you do. But even if you weren't looking things up like that, I think if you went into Acacia blind you would probably have a better time. But with Fisher we don't go into things blind. You're not meant to expect that per se. So that would have been a bit of a discordance with the overall thought of Fisher as a whole. But the whole idea of the mission concept, like that feature, that system, I hope that does not go away anytime soon. Um, that's great. I would love to see that come back. So now the rewards for the mission, or at least completing the missions, were not only just credits and currency that you could use to get rewards. I don't really feel like talking about that because it's not Fisher specific, but the rewards were kind of neat and the drone bits I think were cool. Um, but the relic itself, I think the mission system played really, really well into the relics this year, or this expansion, excuse me. I think it was really fun, a really good way of doing that besides just go collect 50 of these collectibles at a fishing hole. Oops, wait, you mean you don't have inventory space? Sorry, come and turn them in and come back. Um, I think the mission system and the relics played really, really well off each other. Really, really well. Like I thought it was great for Fisher because it was varied content. It was different things you had to adjust. You had to decide what you wanted to do, and you were like, I don't really like this mission, but it's up, but it has the data that I need, so why don't I try that anyways? Um, that was really good. The fact that the effect on the relic was basically the same one that we've had for the past two expansions was again a little disappointing. I really want that like tool feature that they have. Like on Fisher, it reduces the cost of powerful and precision hook set by 50%. Um, or it has a chance to. I want to see that type of idea of this tool, this weapon, this fishing rod has a unique quality to it that has a unique ability. I want to see that everywhere. I want to see that. I want to have. I would love to be able to have multiple rods with different abilities that I have to pick and choose which one I have to use depending on the fish. I think that would be fun, 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 fun. Maybe I can just choose the ability at a time, but I can only have one at a time while I'm fishing. Like something like that, because it gives variety, and that's cool. But that's off topic of cosmic exploration. That's just talking about relics in general. But the mission system again really complemented it for relics. And I think the biggest thing is I think it's great that it's like best in slot, best in slot. Um, I think at the end of Endwalker, the relic wasn't fully best in slot, like just stat wise and stuff like that. I mean, it was effectively best in slot. Like you could use it because it had the ability, but like we really only saw it in ocean fishing. Now it's like you can now hit as of at least as of pre-legendary Dawn Trail, so end of 7.5, but pre-legends, you can hit the minimum gathering needed to catch every fish in Dawn Trail, again, with the exception of the legends, maybe, um, using the latest script gear and a fishing rod and in the relic rod. I think that's cool. That's great. I would love to see that. Um, I want to see that more. So totally expecting some good things, at least hopefully in Evercold with the relics whenever we decide to do that, especially because they're going to be changing stuff up. But overall, I don't have much more else to say about the relic. That's pretty much about it, except in summary, missions were very good for a very good relic system. So gonna carry on with that. Love it. Keep it going. Now the planets themselves, this is gonna be a bit of a side tangent, just going into just slightly less Fisher specific, but still Fisher tangential. So bear with me on this. The planets themselves were interesting in cosmic exploration. Coming from somebody who has a background in astrophysics and astrobiology, whose primary focus and interest in college when getting that degree was on planet habitability and formation. Um, this was really cool to see. And it was a ton of fun to be able to be like, oh, pointing out like, oh, here's how this planet could exist in real life. And you might actually see some more of me talking about this in the future. But that was a ton of fun. It, but one of the things that Fisher does really well is provide additional lore and story via the fish caught. And the fish didn't have that at all in this. And that was a little surprising and a little frustrating. For all the fish that you catch, that goes at least specifically into the guide, it gets a little bit of a story. There's a little bit of lore tied to it, and we can learn a lot about the world and the area that you're in through the fish you catch. That's kind of one of the like the little factors and core tenets of Fisher as a whole. And I understand why this happened because technically none of the fish in Cosmic went into the log, thus do not necessitate that level of like lore add, but uh, it was still a little disappointing to see like, oh, here's this big, we're going to go see all these new worlds and civilizations and like there's ruins and all this stuff and not getting any more story out of it. Like, I think that's probably one of the things that I from like a non-Fisher standpoint, you know, the story itself was kind of a cool thread pull on, that exploration of, now that we have a spaceship, now what? What are we going to do? And I'm not going to go into the spoilers, but like it does play into some of the themes loosely for Endwalker, or at least some of the threads of Endwalker, and I thought that was cool. Like it focused on the stories, the of naming ways story, which was nice. But I didn't. It felt almost like a side tangent. Whereas with like the diadem, that impacted, that was a branch off the main story. It impacted the world itself. It was very direct, very central to the core of the world. Whereas Cosmic just felt very detached, like story wise, and that just felt a little off to me. uh, and that was a little weird as somebody who likes the story, and as somebody who likes the fish lore. And I've talked about this a whole lot. Fish lore is a big part of fishing and something that I always like and look at and appreciate. And so we had this amazing opportunity to get a bunch of new lore about maybe places Medion went, the civilizations Medion went to potentially, and it didn't really get a whole lot. And I think Fisher could have really solved that if they had an ability to add just at least descriptions to the fish to give it a little bit of a story. Now, I'm saying that and you're probably like, well, it makes sense because we don't know what it is. And you're right. Um, the fish guide we know is written from the context of a Charlean scholar, which means that it has been caught and the fish has been caught and studied and recorded. In this particular case, it was completely unknown, so it would make sense that it was unknown, but it could have also been nice to have like maybe your warrior of light tries and makes an observation or something, or naming way, or one of the researchers does it there for you and it's written from that context, at least in the description. I'm not saying that the fish needed to be added to the guide, that would have been insane, but it would have been nice to just get a little bit of more story out of fish. That just felt like a little bit of like a discordance there as well. I think that's the second time I used the word discordance in this review too, which is maybe that's the word of the day for me. I don't know. Anyways, overall, uh, I'm very, very, very confident in saying that Fisher was definitely the winner of cosmic exploration content. Uh, Despite my frustrations, Fisher had probably, from what I could tell, some of the most engaging and most interesting content, most interesting missions in the game, or in out of all the Disciples of Hands and Lands. Uh, I think I had fun for the most part. I didn't have fun for as long as I wanted to, but I still had fun. I think now that I'm able to look at all four of these stops on our cosmic exploration, the one thing that I can speak to overall is that it felt like it was backwards. Not in terms of like, oh, everything was backwards, but like if we started on Acacia, like the structure, maybe not the story, like story wise, that was correct order, correct direction, but the mission difficulty, the progression, the number of missions, how the types of missions that we got mostly felt like it was backwards. I think if I was like if someone came to me and was like, "Hey, Fruity, how should I start? Where should I start Arcasia or not Arcasia? Where should I start Cosmic?" I'll say, start at Arcasia and work backwards because that is the better build up, I think, of education. Sinus, I think, was still a very good education tool for learning your classes, learning your jobs, learning your skills, especially for Fisher. But now that I see the whole planet or the whole suite of planets, I think if you started in Occasion, and you're like, I don't know how to play Fisher, I just hit 100 ocean fishing, but I want to learn, I'm going to tell you to start in Occasia, do all the Fisher missions in Occasia, then do all the Fisher missions in Oasis, then in Fena, then in Sinus. That is the progression of order that if I was to say, here is your training to be a better fisher, I would say go in the reverse order. And I think they should have done that from the start. Now I know hindsight's 2020. I blah 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 blah. I know that there's a whole lot of other potential things that I haven't even touched on that could have, arisen for why this happened and why things were missing and why things were added when they were. But in, as a complete package coming into it, maybe you're listening to this before starting Cosmic Exploration, you're going to enjoy it as a fisher. But I would start with Alcasia if you're not very confident and work backwards because Sinus now definitely feels like the final test for Fisher compared to where it started. And I think part of the reason why there was so much feedback on Sinus early on was because it did end up feeling like that final step, and it did feel like maybe you were being thrown in a little bit even though you weren't. I still think it's a good starting point, but in the context of everything now, I'll be like, no, start with Acacia, then Oasis, then Fena, then Sinus, and go backwards. So I think that's like the weirdest big thing, but yeah. But overall, I would love to see the mission structure again. I would love to see this style fleshed out even further or expanded on or refined or whatever they decide to do with it. Um, Refine it more towards, I would say, Sinus than Acacia because I think, well, I've already explained why Sinus had more interesting missions. But maybe it would be interesting to see this tied more into the core world. I think Fisher could do a lot more interesting things with its missions if it was within some of the pre-existing fishing holes and working within that. Now I know technically that might not be a thing, but as a fisher, which is a very much a community-driven lore, lore supporting job, being able to have missions in the overworld in existing fishing holes or even at least in existing zones would be, I think, a big benefit to the game, or a small benefit because it's Fisher, but you kind of get the idea of what I'm saying here. It's like that would be a cool thing of bringing it back into the main world again, and maybe instead of a different planet, it's a different region each time. First time Vilbrand, second time Garabania, third time, uh, fine, we'll go back to the first for a bit. Fourth time, Thavner, I don't know, Garlemald. Um, and being able to use that not only as a way to just get people engaged, in older zones with older content, but also to, provide more story. Provide, because that's what Fisher can do a lot of is provide story because of the fish we catch. Provide that. Give us that avenue to do that. But yeah, I would love to see the structure again. Maybe in an overworld setting, but it gives us a little bit more story and lore to the core game, and not just some planets that we'll probably not see or refer back to ever again. Well, who knows? Maybe we will. That would be wild, but Yeah. So overall, Cosmic Exploration gets a thumbs up from me. Definitely fun content. Definitely not as good as I think it could have been, at least personally. But let me know what you guys think, obviously, down in the comments below. That's it for me this week. Thank you all. Good luck and happy fishing.